Let's talk about war. Not whether we want it. No rational person wants war, but what it takes to win it when it's necessary. Today, we look at the war in Iran from the perspective of America's vast common sense majority, and we're bringing to the table straightforward ideas that most of us can support. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the show. I'm James Pepe, and this is PepTalks. As usual, we begin with agreement, because agreement leads to unity, and unity leads to progress. Most Americans agree that we have a vital national interest in a stable, peaceful Middle East. We understand implicitly that instability brought about by perpetual conflict and cycles of violence poses a constant threat to the global economy and, by extension, to American prosperity right here at home. And though we've come to accept a certain degree of that persistent instability as a stubborn fact of life in that part of the world, we also recognize that Iran has been a ticking time bomb that we were inevitably going to have to deal with one way or another. To be sure, there are always some who disagree with that logic, who look at the world beyond America's borders and see nothing but other people's problems. Problems that, to their way of thinking, have nothing to do with us and about which they couldn't care less. Extremists at the very fringe of the America First movement are the ones pushing this view in their relentless, self-serving pursuit of power and wealth and control. But it's a notion that's dangerously tantalizing to regular folks, human beings who are naturally susceptible to forgetting the lessons of history and ignoring the inescapable interconnectedness of the modern world. And it's precisely the way extreme isolationists manipulate us, brazenly lying to prey on those human weaknesses, intentionally misleading us with tempting assertions like, "This is different. We're not Nazi Germany. We'd never do that. And we don't need the rest of the world and all their problems. We have everything we need right here at home." They're part of the corrupt power establishment we talk so much about here on PepTalks. And it's imperative that we learn to recognize and reject their poisonous influence. And while we work tirelessly to that end here, I want to credit President Trump, whose interventions in Iran and elsewhere make it crystal clear that those extreme isolationists actually represent just a very tiny few of us. In other words, for the vast majority of us, including even Trump himself and most of MAGA, America First isn't America alone. It's simply about picking our battles and investing our limited resources more carefully. That's what we should take from his attack on Iran, that America's overseas interests are real and significant, and sometimes require our direct engagement to defend. So let me repeat this for emphasis, because it's absolutely crucial. CommonSense Americans reject isolationism and agree with President Trump that we have important interests around the world that require our vigilant defense. This is a critical example of our fundamental unity. Unity that is rarely acknowledged by the media and the corrupt power establishment that controls it. But as I said before, that's always our starting point here on PepTalks, with positive reminders about our agreements that then allow us to effectively build towards the kind of progress most of us really want. So now we've established that fundamental unity, along with an understanding that the loudest voices of continued division belong to a mere tiny minority of extreme isolationists, still fighting to force our retreat behind the tall walls of Fortress America. Those extreme voices we must ignore, just as President Trump has, as we move to the next logical step of common sense progress, overcoming our lack of agreement over precisely what those interests are and when and how we should act to defend them. Unfortunately, this is where President Trump, much like too many presidents before him, falls short in his responsibility to unite us behind a clear, common sense plan. And of course, it's very difficult for a nation to wage war and achieve its aims without the unified support of its people. Just think Vietnam. So what would it take for Trump to pull the country together behind his military objectives in Iran? Well, fear not, because providing common sense leadership is what PepTalks is all about. So here's how we would advise the president. First, he should address the nation repeatedly if necessary and restate the common sense defense of our vital interests as the premise of our actions. Something simple like this. My fellow Americans, our nation has an urgent interest in promoting Middle East peace and ensuring the stability of global energy markets, stability that is essential for a healthy and prosperous American economy. In recent months, Iran's threat to that stability has grown to the point that it can no longer be tolerated, lest the problem grow so big that our inevitable future intervention will be far more costly in American blood and treasure. That's why I have initiated this action and intend to stay the course until the job is truly finished and Iran no longer poses such a threat. Now, after that, President Trump should carefully reset and clarify with certainty America's mission objectives, describe in plain language what success will look like, and bluntly state his anticipated timeline for our direct engagement and/or exit strategy. If regime change is his aim, as he has at times suggested, he should say something like this. We've tried economic sanctions, which have successfully pushed the Iranian regime to the brink of collapse, but still failed to curb its antagonism and region-wide threats. And so our patience has run out with that approach. We've tried destroying Iran's offensive military capabilities and have had significant success with that as well. However, even just a few months later, the regime has indicated its reckless intent to rebuild those capabilities and continue threatening its neighbors. So we recognize the unsatisfactory Band-Aid effect of that approach too. At the end of the day, I've decided it's time to put an end to the normal political game of kicking the problem down the road for the next president to deal with. That's why I've initiated a plan to remove all remnants of Iran's outlaw regime and work with the Iranian people to give their country back to them, establishing a democratic process that lets them control their own destiny while living in peace with their neighbors and enjoying the great economic prosperity that lies just beneath their feet. Make no mistake, this will be a long and grueling mission. In fact, we may be there in one form or another for decades or longer. Without question, there will be real pain, bloodshed, and economic cost. Given the alternatives, however, I assure you that the benefits of finally bringing peace and stability to that region will be well worth it. There. Finally, the president needs to repeat these messages, remind us of our foundational agreement about defending our vital interests, and reaffirm our steadfast commitment every day. If instead, he makes the same error as too many of his predecessors and fails to do this, those extreme isolationists will rush to fill the void with their power-seeking ambitions and manipulative lies to undermine the mission and once again make our investments of blood and treasure a tragic waste. It's time to break that historic cycle. That is what President Trump should do, however he chooses to say it. But it must be clear, firm, unwavering, and unapologetic. Despite the difficulty of such a mission, this is the right thing for stability in the Middle East and for the people all across that region who are exhausted by generations of conflict, strife, and suffering. It's the right thing for all the nations of the world that desperately crave the same peace, stability, and prosperity that we do. Most importantly, however, it's the right thing for America, for us, for our long-term security and economic prosperity. Yes, this is what President Trump should do, and I hope he does. Too often, especially with respect to conflicts in this volatile part of the world, presidents have been unwilling to trust us with the cold, hard truth. So they dress it up in noble philosophy and then promise us that the cost will be minimal and our time commitment short. Misleading messaging that undermines our objectives in two important and related ways. One, by failing to effectively convey our true national interests in a way that will sustain a long-term commitment. And two, by raising expectations for unrealistically rapid success, all but ensuring failure and the demand to withdraw when that rapid success does not materialize. This is the vicious cycle I referred to a moment ago that presidents have created and perpetuated, putting their own political agendas before the good of the nation, punting the problem to a future president, and guaranteeing the continuation of the threat and the high cost of dealing with it indefinitely. At a minimum, President Trump has done us the favor of clarifying what America First means to him and most of his followers, clearly rejecting extreme isolationism as being even too radical for him, and setting the stage for discussions like this one that can move us forward in unity. Now it's up to us, the CommonSense Majority, to pick up the ball and run with it. We agree that our own interests in security and economic prosperity right here at home can be impacted by foreign circumstances. In plain spoken, blunt terms, we can see how Iran has been a threat to those interests. And through a clear-eyed analysis of the very few options available to us, a common sense conclusion quickly becomes clear. We can pay the price of defending our vital interests now. We can pay an unsustainable ongoing price going forward indefinitely. Or we can pay even more down the road when a larger crisis inevitably explodes. Look, as my dad used to say, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. If the isolationists have their way and force America to withdraw from global leadership, don't think for a minute that our problems here at home will go away. That's the false choice we're being pushed to. The game the corrupt power establishment has designed to increase their power and wealth at our expense. But we can and must vigorously defend our critical national interests on all fronts at the same time, even as we responsibly tend to everyday domestic challenges. President Trump and most of MAGA agree with that, and so do most of the rest of us. All of this is to sharpen the focus on the real issues now and into the future. Without a doubt, America's CommonSense Majority rejects isolationism and recognizes that we have interests around the world that require our defense. However, we don't always agree on what those interests are, or if they rise to a level of importance that justifies our intervention. Clearly defining them and rallying essential public support behind an understandable and sensible course of action is a critical, ongoing responsibility of leadership, and with all due respect, something President Trump must do a better job of. As an aside, in my humble opinion, it's been decades since we've had this sort of leader in the White House, so Trump is certainly not alone in his shortcoming. We'll dive deeper into this aspect of presidential leadership in future pepisodes, but for now, I'll offer this simple guide for how to think about America's interests around the world beyond the current conflict with Iran. First, and most obviously, American interests exist when the direct safety of the American people is threatened by hostile adversaries, regardless of where the danger originates. Distance offers little protection in an age of long-range missiles, cyber warfare, and global terrorist networks. Second, American interests exist when aggressive powers seek dominance over strategically important regions of the world. Time and time again, history shows that when expansionist regimes are allowed to conquer their neighbors unchecked, the consequences rarely remain confined to the original battlefield. Preventing such domination has long been a critical cornerstone of American foreign policy and must remain so. Third, American interests exist when our strategic allies are threatened. Nations cooperate with the United States, share vital intelligence, and sometimes even risk their own security because they believe America will stand by them in times of crisis. If that confidence erodes, alliances weaken, and the international environment becomes far more unpredictable and dangerous. Fourth, American interests exist when its economic prosperity is dependent upon access to foreign markets. Americans have a practical interest in global economic stability and prosperity, and understand implicitly that we are deeply connected to the world through trade, energy and financial markets, and global supply chains. Disruptions to these systems have real-world consequences for American families, from shortages and rising prices to reduced wages and unemployment. And finally, American interests exist when opportunities present themselves to advance the causes of democracy, freedom, human rights, and peace. A world in which democratic societies flourish, where conflict between neighbor states is minimized, and where people are free to pursue their own ideas of happy, fulfilling lives, is safer and more stable for all of us. Supporting those principles does not require intervening everywhere injustice occurs, but it does reflect an enduring belief about the kind of international order that best serves both our security and our values. These ideas are hardly radical. They reflect a common sense understanding that has shaped American foreign policy on a largely bipartisan basis for decades. Each reinforces the others, and together they offer a practical framework for assessing crises around the world and ultimately determining the wisdom of potential American involvement. Okay, before we close out for today, I want to emphasize another important point about Pep Talks. As you know, we're all about common sense here. But the truth is that common sense can often be a bit boring. Practical solutions and compromise, two of the distinguishing features of common sense, aren't nearly as sensational and riveting as what extremists promote. So, if we really want to change the world around us, make our everyday lives happier by restoring common sense rules of the road, so to speak, we have to work harder at it. And by that, I simply mean we have to resist being sucked in by every extremist drama and instead be willing to pay close attention to the dry but critical stuff. And just as importantly, diligently advocate the importance of that stuff to others around us. So thank you for your dedication to this important challenge. I'm extraordinarily grateful. So once more in closing, let's summarize today's important episode. President Trump is right to reject the extremism of America First isolationists and assert our vital interests in the Middle East and elsewhere. But he has much work remaining to advance a winning strategy. Meanwhile, we call upon him to apply the same principles we outlined earlier to other parts of the world where our interests are just as critical, starting with Ukraine. Some recoil at the thought of the United States acting as the world's policeman, and we get it. But that's one of the favorite tactics extreme isolationists use to manipulate us into retreat, and we must reject it. America must lead the world toward peace and stability, because if we don't, who will? Only we can do it. We must do it. For Pep Talks, I'm James Pepe, America's voice of common sense, reminding you to stay proud, get loud, and never doubt your power to make things better. Thanks, everybody.